At 9:30 a.m. on the morning of November 20th, 1980, a drilling platform operated by Texaco was positioned over Lake Peigneur in southern Louisiana. The rig was drilling an exploratory oil well, targeting a suspected oil reservoir beneath the lake. Everything seemed normal. The crew was running the drill string into the ground, following standard procedure. The lake itself was calm, a shallow body of fresh water about 2.5 miles wide and 11 feet deep, connected to the Gulf of Mexico by a canal and a series of locks. Only a few minutes later, something was off. At 9:37 a.m., the drill bit suddenly dropped. The crew felt a jarring, unnatural shudder through the rig. The torque on the drill string increased sharply, and then the bit fell into what seemed like empty space. The drillers tried to pull the string back up, but it became stuck. The rig's engine strained. The crew radioed the onshore supervisor. Something was wrong. At 9:45 a.m., the platform began to tilt. The massive steel legs shifted, and the deck started to list to the side. The crew knew they had to evacuate. Within minutes, all 8 men on the rig had scrambled into lifeboats and motored away from the platform. They watched from a safe distance as the rig continued to lean, then slowly began to slide down into the water. What had happened? The drill bit had not hit an oil reservoir. It had punctured the roof of an active salt mine. Beneath Lake Peigneur, the Diamond Crystal Salt Company had been mining salt for decades, excavating a vast network of tunnels and caverns hundreds of feet below the lake bed. The mine was the largest salt mine in the United States, with more than 50 miners working underground that morning. When the drill bit broke through, it created a hole, a direct channel from the lake into the mine. Millions of gallons of lake water began to pour into the caverns. The water rushed downward with tremendous force, eroding the hole wider and wider. Within minutes, the entire lake was being drained into the earth. At 10 a.m., the crew of the drilling rig had safely reached the shore. They called the Texaco office and reported the incident. The company immediately notified the Coast Guard and the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources. But by then, the situation was already accelerating beyond control. The water level in Lake Peigneur was dropping at an alarming rate. The lake began to boil and churn as air and sediment were sucked into the widening vortex. Trees along the shoreline started to tilt and fall. The dock of a nearby botanical garden, used by tourists, collapsed into the water. Boats moored at the lake's edge were pulled away by the current. At 10:30 a.m., the Coast Guard issued a navigational warning and began coordinating a response. They contacted the lockmaster at the Intracoastal Waterway, which connected Lake Peigneur to the Gulf. The lockmaster reported that the water in the canal was flowing backwards, toward the lake, toward the sinkhole. The current was strong enough to pull barges. At 10:45 a.m., a tugboat towing a barge loaded with silt tried to enter the canal from the Gulf side, but the tug could not fight the current. The tow line snapped. The barge, empty of its crew, was swept into the lake. It circled the growing whirlpool for several minutes before being swallowed whole. The tugboat barely escaped. Meanwhile, the miners underground had no idea what was happening. At 9:55 a.m., the first sign of trouble reached the mine. A foreman in the central tunnel heard a distant rumble, then felt a rush of air. Water began to drip from the ceiling. He ordered an evacuation. The miners made their way to the main shaft, where the cage elevator normally took them to the surface. But the elevator was not responding. The power had been cut. The miners waited in darkness. Some of them later reported hearing a roar like a waterfall. They knew the lake was pouring in, but they did not know how fast. The foreman led the men to an emergency escape shaft, a spiral staircase cut into the salt rock. They began to climb. It was a long way to the surface. At 11 a.m., the Coast Guard contacted the Diamond Crystal Salt Company and learned that there were miners underground. A rescue operation was initiated, but the surface above the mine was now unstable. The sinkhole was expanding. The water in Lake Peigneur had dropped to less than 3 feet deep in places. The drilling platform had completely disappeared beneath the surface. The barge was gone. Trees, buildings, and vehicles along the shore were being swallowed one by one. Geologists from the state arrived and began assessing the situation. They realized that the entire lake might collapse into the mine. At 11:15 a.m., the first miner emerged from the emergency shaft. He ran down the hill toward the road, covered in white salt dust. He told the first responders that there were more men still inside. The rescue crews could not enter the mine because the shaft was still flooding. They had to wait. One by one, over the next 2 hours, the remaining miners climbed the spiral staircase, sometimes ankle-deep in water that was rising behind them. The last miner emerged at 1:20 p.m. All 50 miners survived. None were seriously injured, but the lake was gone. By 2 p.m., Lake Peigneur had become a massive crater. The water that had not drained into the mine was now flowing in from the Gulf through the canal, creating a 20-foot waterfall where the lake used to be. The waterfall was not natural. It was man-made, entirely artificial, the tallest waterfall in Louisiana. It lasted for nearly 2 days. The sinkhole eventually stabilized and the lake refilled with seawater, becoming deeper and saltier than before. The drilling rig was never recovered. The barge was later found at the bottom of the mine, buried in salt. How could this have happened? Investigators from the U.S. Bureau of Mines and the Louisiana Office of Mineral Resources launched an inquiry. They examined the drilling logs, the mine maps, and the sequence of events. They found that Texaco had obtained a permit to drill for oil in the area, but the drilling company had not accounted for the presence of the salt mine. The mine was known to exist, but its precise extent was not fully documented. The mine had been in operation since the 1900s, and the tunnels had been extended over the years. The salt dome itself was a geologic feature that had been mapped in broad strokes, but the boundary between the mined area and the proposed drilling site was uncertain. Texaco had drilled a relief well a few hundred feet away earlier that year without incident, but this well was different. The drill bit had been guided by a directional drilling technique that allowed the well to deviate from vertical. The intended target was a petroleum-bearing zone beneath the lake, but the drill path had strayed outside the permitted area. The actual location of the wellbore intersected the mine works. Whether it was a miscalculation or a simple error has never been fully settled. The final report concluded that the accident was caused by the drill bit penetrating the mine roof, but it did not assign criminal liability. Texaco paid settlements to the owners of the sunken property, including the botanical garden, the barges, and the drilling equipment. The salt company lost its mine and filed a civil suit. The case was eventually settled out of court. The disaster became a case study in the dangers of drilling near active mines and the need for accurate mapping of underground cavities. It also highlighted the risks of relying on outdated or incomplete geological survey data. Since 1980, regulations have been tightened. Drilling permits now require a thorough review of nearby mining operations, and companies must demonstrate that their wellbores will not intersect any underground voids. But the question remains, how many other lakes, mines, and drilling sites across the country have similar hidden vulnerabilities? The Lake Peigneur disaster is not a unique event. It is a warning. The human consequences were immediate and profound. The miners who escaped carried the memory of that dark climb, the sound of water behind them. The workers on the drilling platform had to watch their rig sink. The owners of the botanical garden, which had been a popular tourist attraction for decades, lost not only their dock and trees, but also the entire landscape. The garden was rebuilt, but it sits on the edge of a lake that is now over 200 feet deep in places, where before it was shallow enough to wade across. The sinkhole itself remains, a lasting scar on the Louisiana swamp. The event has been described as a man-made disaster, an industrial accident, and a freak occurrence. But the simplest explanation is that two industrial operations, one extracting salt and one searching for oil, were using the same underground space without enough knowledge of each other. The system that allowed this to happen had gaps in communication, in mapping, in oversight. The drill bit did not cause the disaster by itself. It was the failure of information to flow from the mine operator to the drilling company, and from the regulator to both. Why does this still matter? Because the technology for drilling and mining has advanced, but the fundamental problem of underground conflict remains. As we drill deeper for oil, as we expand salt mines for chemical storage, and as we explore geothermal energy or carbon sequestration, the risk of intersecting unknown cavities grows. The Lake Peigneur disaster is a reminder that the ground beneath our feet is not empty. It is full of holes, some natural, some man-made, and some lost to memory. The investigators who examined the drilling logs found a critical anomaly that had been overlooked in real time. At 9:25 a.m., shortly after the drill bit had entered the mine, the drilling mud pressure dropped sharply. The crew on the platform noted a loss of circulation. The drilling mud was not returning to the surface as expected. That is a classic sign that the drill has encountered a void. In a normal drilling operation, such a loss triggers an immediate halt. The crew is supposed to check for fractures, cavities, or unexpected formations. But on the morning of November 20th, 1980, the crew did not stop. They recorded the pressure drop in the log, but they did not report it to the supervisor. The log shows they continued rotating the drill string for another 11 minutes. By 9:36 a.m., the drill bit had fully punctured the mine roof. The mud flowed into the mine, and the lake water followed. Why did the crew not stop? The answer lies in the nature of directional drilling itself. The well was being deviated from vertical in order to reach a target zone under the lake. The drill bit was guided by a set of measurements taken from the surface, but those measurements had an inherent margin of error. The survey instruments of that era were not as precise as modern gyroscopic tools. The wellbore could have drifted several feet from the planned trajectory without anyone realizing it. The crew on the platform had no real-time visualization of the underground geometry. They only had a paper map showing the mine boundaries as drawn by the salt company. That map was based on surveys conducted decades earlier, and it did not include the most recent tunnel extensions. The mine had been actively expanding, and the foreman had not updated the official mine plan in the year prior to the accident. The gap between the map and the reality was wide enough to fit a drill bit. At 9:40 a.m., the platform crew noticed the lake's surface begin to ripple. They assumed it was a gas kick or a minor disturbance. But by 9:45 a.m., the water level around the platform had dropped several feet. The platform itself began to tilt as the ground beneath it eroded. The crew scrambled to disconnect the drill string and evacuate. They made it to a small boat just before the platform sank. The boat, too, was soon caught in the current. They were rescued by a passing fishing vessel that had been watching the strange behavior of the lake from a distance. The fishermen later told reporters that they saw the platform disappear as if it were being pulled down by a giant hand. The miners underground experienced a more gradual onset of disaster. At 9:55 a.m., the foreman heard the distant roar and felt the rush of air. He immediately ordered the evacuation, but the main shaft elevator was not working because the power had been cut at the surface. The miners were trapped in the dark. They had two options: wait for rescue from above or climb the emergency spiral staircase. The staircase was narrow, with over 1,000 steps. It had not been used in years. The foreman, a man named Mike Landry, led the group. He told the men to stay calm and follow him. The water behind them rose slowly at first, then faster as the lake poured in through the drill hole. The miners could hear the cascade echoing through the tunnels. Some of them later said they could feel the air pressure changing as the water displaced the air. They climbed for nearly an hour before reaching the surface hatch. When they emerged, they saw a landscape that had been transformed. The lake was gone. The drilling platform was gone. The barge was gone. The ground was covered in mud and debris. The last miner emerged at 1:20 p.m. He later described the climb as the longest hour of his life. He thought he would die. Instead, he survived, but he carried the memory for the rest of his days. The mine was permanently flooded. Millions of dollars of equipment and infrastructure were lost. The salt company had to abandon the entire operation. The town of New Iberia, which relied on the mine for jobs and tax revenue, suffered an economic blow that took years to recover from. The oil company, Texaco, paid out settlements that, adjusted for inflation, totaled more than $100 million, but no amount of money could undo what had happened. The investigation also revealed a series of communication failures. The salt company had known for months that Texaco was planning to drill near the lake. The mining engineers had even asked for the exact coordinates of the proposed well. Texaco provided them, but the coordinates were based on the same imperfect surveys. The salt company did not cross-check those coordinates against their own underground measurements. There was no formal protocol for sharing geological data between the two companies. The state regulatory agency, the Louisiana Office of Mineral Resources, had issued the drilling permit without requiring a detailed map of the mine. The regulatory system assumed that the driller would avoid known hazards, but the hazard was not fully known. The drill bit itself was a tricone roller bit designed to crush rock. It was not equipped with any sensor to detect cavities. When it broke into the mine, the sudden change in resistance would have been noticeable to the driller. The driller reported a slight vibration, but he attributed it to the directional change. He did not stop because he had no reason to suspect he was drilling into a void. The directional drilling company had provided a predicted path that showed the well passing safely above the mine. That prediction was wrong by at least 20 feet. Whether that error was caused by a miscalculation in the survey tool, a mistake in the interpretation of the data, or a simple misalignment of the surface equipment remains unclear. The investigation report noted that the survey tool had not been calibrated immediately before the job. The error margins were not verified. The disaster also exposed a gap in the understanding of salt dome geology. Salt domes are massive columns of salt that rise through the surrounding rock layers. They are often associated with oil and gas deposits because the salt traps hydrocarbons in the adjacent formations. The same salt domes are also mined for the salt itself. The Lake Peigneur salt dome was one of the largest in Louisiana. The mine had been carved out of the top of the dome, just beneath the lake bed. The roof of the mine was only a few hundred feet thick. The drill bit had to penetrate that roof to reach the oil below, but the thickness of the roof varied. In some areas, it was over 300 feet. In the area where the drill bit entered, it was less than 100. The mine map showed the tunnels near the surface, but the vertical distance between the mine roof and the lake bed was not accurately known. The driller assumed there was enough rock to protect the mine. He was wrong. After the accident, the state of Louisiana passed new regulations requiring that any drilling near a salt mine must be preceded by a seismic survey to map the underground cavities. The seismic surveys use sound waves to detect voids. They are expensive but effective. The regulations also mandated that the driller must maintain a minimum distance from the mine boundary, and that distance must be verified by an independent surveyor. The salt company, for its part, was required to update its mine maps annually and submit them to the state. These regulations have prevented similar disasters in the same region, but other parts of the world have not been as proactive. In the decades since 1980, there have been several similar incidents. In 1994, a sinkhole opened in central Florida after a phosphate mining operation collapsed into a cavity. In 1998, a drilling operation in Texas punctured an underground brine cavern, causing a sinkhole that swallowed a 3-acre pond. In 2007, a drill bit in Germany punctured a salt mine, causing a catastrophic flood that miraculously killed no one because the miners had already evacuated. Each of these events echoed the Lake Peigneur disaster. The root cause was always the same: incomplete knowledge of the subsurface. The Lake Peigneur disaster is often described as a freak accident, but it was not random. It was the predictable outcome of a system that prioritized speed and cost over caution. The drilling company was in a hurry to reach the oil reservoir before a competing company. The salt company was expanding its tunnels without fully mapping them. The regulator did not have the resources to inspect every well site. The drillers did not have the tools to see where they were going. The miners trusted that the lake above them was safe. Everyone assumed that the other party knew what they were doing. That assumption was the real failure. The aftermath also brought a legal reckoning. The civil lawsuits lasted for years. Texaco argued that the salt company should have known the mine would be vulnerable. The salt company argued that Texaco had drilled into an area that was clearly marked on the map as off-limits. The map, however, was ambiguous. The boundary lines were drawn in pencil. The mine tunnels had been extended beyond the original boundary without updating the master map. The court eventually settled the case, with both sides agreeing to a confidentiality order that sealed the exact terms. The public never learned how much money changed hands, but the cost was high enough that it changed corporate behavior. After the disaster, both Texaco and the Diamond Crystal Salt Company implemented new internal procedures for cross-checking well locations against mine plans. Today, the site of the disaster looks different. Lake Peigneur is still there, but it is no longer a freshwater lake. It is a brackish lagoon fed by the Gulf of Mexico through the canal. The water is deep, over 200 feet in places. The bottom of the lake is the roof of the collapsed mine, now filled with saltwater and debris. The botanical garden was rebuilt, but it sits on a new shoreline that is steeper and more unstable than the old one. Visitors can still see the waterfall that formed when the lake drained. It is now a tourist attraction, a strange reminder of human error. The miners who survived kept working. Some moved to other mines. Others left the industry entirely. Mike Landry, the foreman, remained in Louisiana. He gave few interviews, but when he did, he always said the same thing. He was lucky. He had been minutes away from being trapped. The drill bit had penetrated the mine at a time when the workers were near the main shaft. If it had happened an hour later, they would have been deeper underground and the water would have reached them faster. The timing was on their side. The disaster also inspired a small but significant change in the culture of drilling. After Lake Peigneur, drilling companies began to treat loss of circulation as an emergency rather than an inconvenience. The phrase "drilling into a void" became a term used in safety briefings. The incident is still taught in petroleum engineering schools as a cautionary tale. It is a case study in the importance of survey accuracy, communication between operators, and the limits of human judgment. At 7:30 p.m. on the 20th of November 1980, the drill bit on Texaco Rig 20 finally stopped turning. The driller had noticed the loss of circulation an hour earlier. He had tried to pump mud down the hole, but the mud simply disappeared. He had tried to pull the drill string back, but the string was stuck. By 7:30, the well had already been abandoned. The crew began to evacuate the platform. They were relieved that no one had been hurt. They did not know that the disaster had only just begun. At 7:45 p.m., the first reports of strange activity on the lake reached the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office. Boats were being pulled backward, away from the drilling platform. The water was swirling. A barge anchored near the platform had broken its moorings and was drifting toward the center of the lake. The sheriff's office dispatched a patrol boat to investigate. The patrol boat arrived at 8:05 p.m. The officer saw the water level dropping rapidly. He called for help, but by then, the lake was already emptying. At 8:15 p.m., the water level had dropped by 10 feet. The canal that connected the lake to the Gulf of Mexico had reversed its flow. Normally, the canal carried fresh water from the lake to the Gulf. Now, salt water from the Gulf was rushing into the lake, creating a powerful current. The current was so strong that it began to erode the canal banks. The canal widened. The water poured into the lake, but the lake could not hold it. The water was falling into the hole. At 8:30 p.m., the drill platform tilted. The crew on the platform had already evacuated, but the platform itself was now unstable. The legs of the platform were sinking into the soft lake bed. The platform began to list to one side. At 8:35 p.m., the platform capsized. It rolled over and sank into the lake, disappearing into the expanding sinkhole. The crew watched from the shore. They could not believe what they were seeing. At 8:45 p.m., the lake had drained completely. Where the lake had been, there was now a muddy depression, hundreds of feet deep. The bottom of the depression was a slurry of mud, salt, and debris. The mine shaft was now open to the sky. The 3 barges that had been in the lake were gone, sucked into the hole. The tugboat that had been towing one of the barges was also gone, along with the drilling platform and the supply boat. 11 vessels had been lost. None of the crew had been on board, but the vessels themselves were gone. At 9 p.m., the first rescue boat arrived at the edge of the sinkhole. The boat could not get close because the water was too shallow. The rescuers had to walk across the mud flat. They searched for survivors, but there were none. The miners had escaped. The drill crew had escaped. The only casualties were the equipment and the environment. The question that followed was simple: what now? The immediate concern was the salt water. The canal was still carrying Gulf water into the lake. The water was flooding the sinkhole, but the sinkhole was filling slowly. The water level in the sinkhole was rising, but it would take hours to fill the entire cavity. The salt water was also contaminating the freshwater aquifer beneath the lake. The aquifer supplied drinking water to the surrounding parishes. The Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality was notified at 9:15 p.m. They began to monitor the water quality. At 10 p.m., the governor of Louisiana, David Treen, declared a state of emergency. He activated the National Guard to secure the area. The sinkhole was unstable. The edges were collapsing. The mud was treacherous. The guard set up a perimeter and kept the curious away. By midnight, the sinkhole had stopped expanding. The water level in the sinkhole had risen to within a few feet of the original lake level. The canal was still flowing, but the flow had slowed. The lake was slowly refilling, but it would never be the same freshwater lake it had been. It was now a saltwater lagoon. The next morning, the 21st of November, the scale of the disaster became clear. The drilling platform was gone. The barges were gone. The botanical garden was partially destroyed. The lake had changed from a shallow freshwater pond to a deep saltwater basin. The water depth in the center of the lake was now over 200 feet. The sinkhole was roughly the size of a football field, but it was irregularly shaped. The edges were steep. The water was cloudy. The investigation began immediately. The National Transportation Safety Board, the United States Geological Survey, the Louisiana Office of Mineral Resources, and the United States Coast Guard all sent teams. They interviewed the miners, the drill crew, the witnesses. They collected the drill logs, the mine maps, the survey data. They reconstructed the sequence of events with precision. The investigation found that the drill bit had entered the mine at a depth of 375 feet below the lake bed. The mine roof was only 300 feet thick at that point. The drill bit had punched through the roof. The cavity below was 20 feet high. The drill bit had entered the cavity and then continued drilling into the floor of the mine. The drill string had penetrated the mine tunnel and then the tunnel floor. The mine tunnel was filled with compressed air. The air was at a pressure of about 15 pounds per square inch above atmospheric pressure. When the drill bit punctured the tunnel, the compressed air escaped into the wellbore. The air pushed the drilling mud out of the well. The mud spewed out of the top of the drill pipe. The driller saw the mud being ejected and knew something was wrong. He shut down the pump. The compressed air continued to escape, but the tunnel was large. The air pressure dropped slowly. The drill string was still in the hole. The driller tried to pull it out, but the string was stuck. The bit had become wedged in the tunnel roof. The driller could not move it. He tried to rotate the string, but the bit would not turn. He decided to abandon the string and pull the surface equipment away from the well. The crew disconnected the drill pipe from the rig and moved the rig back. They left the drill string in the hole. The drill string acted as a conduit. The compressed air continued to escape through the pipe. The air pressure in the mine dropped. The mine was ventilated by a system of fans that drew fresh air from the surface. The fans were still running. They pulled air from the tunnels. But with the drill string open, the fans were pulling air from the lake. The lake water began to seep into the mine through the drill bit. The water flowed down the drill string and into the tunnel. The flow was slow at first. The water was only a trickle, but the tunnel was at a lower pressure than the lake. The lake was at atmospheric pressure while the tunnel was slightly compressed. When the escape of compressed air reduced the tunnel pressure, the water began to flow faster. The tunnel filled with water. The water then flowed into the other tunnels, which were at even lower pressure. The mine was a network of chambers and corridors. The water found its way to the main shaft. The main shaft was a vertical tunnel that connected the mine to the surface. It was located at the edge of the lake, about 100 yards from the drill site. The shaft was lined with concrete. The bottom of the shaft was about 1,000 feet below the surface. The shaft was used for transporting miners and equipment. It was also used for ventilation. When the water reached the main shaft, it flowed down the shaft, but the shaft was not sealed at the bottom. The water could not flow upward because the shaft was open to the atmosphere at the top. Instead, the water filled the shaft from below. The water level in the shaft rose quickly. The water reached the top of the shaft and overflowed into the lake. But the lake was already draining. The water from the mine was adding to the flow. The sinkhole had formed. The water was now pouring into the mine through the sinkhole itself. The investigation later calculated that the lake water entered the mine at a rate of about 100,000 cubic feet per second. That is the equivalent of one Olympic swimming pool every 3 seconds. The mine had a volume of about 150 million cubic feet. It took about 20 minutes for the mine to fill completely. The water that entered the mine was replaced by water from the canal. The canal carried salt water from the Gulf. The lake became salty. The environmental impact was severe. The freshwater ecosystem of the lake was destroyed. The fish, the plants, the insects, all were killed. The lake became a dead zone. The salt water brought new species, but the transition was violent. The water quality in the aquifer deteriorated. The drinking water wells in the area had to be monitored for years. The botanical garden suffered. The garden had been planted with exotic species from around the world. Some of the plants were rare. Many of them died when the lake drained. The soil was contaminated with salt. The garden was rebuilt, but the collection was never the same. The legal aftermath was protracted. The lawsuits were filed within days of the disaster. Texaco was sued by the Diamond Crystal Salt Company, by the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources, by the owners of the barges, by the owners of the botanical garden, and by several insurance companies. The suits alleged negligence, trespass, and breach of contract. The central question in the lawsuits was, who was responsible for the error in the survey? The well path had been surveyed by a directional drilling company called Eastman Whipstock. The survey tool they used was a magnetic multi-shot instrument. It measured the inclination and azimuth of the wellbore at regular intervals. The data was used to calculate the position of the well. The investigation found that the survey tool had not been calibrated before the job. The calibration procedure required the tool to be tested in a known magnetic field. This test had not been performed. The tool had been used on a previous job, and it had not been recalibrated since. The error in the survey was introduced by a faint magnetic interference inside the drill pipe. The interference was caused by a small magnetic anomaly in the steel of the pipe. The anomaly was too small to be detected without a calibration test. The error was about 20 feet. That 20 feet was the difference between the well being safely above the mine and the well drilling directly into the mine. If the tool had been calibrated, the error would have been discovered. The driller would have known that the well was drifting downward. He would have adjusted the direction. The disaster would not have happened. Eastman Whipstock settled the lawsuits out of court. The terms were confidential. Texaco also settled. The Diamond Crystal Salt Company settled. The total amount of money paid to the various plaintiffs is not publicly known. However, legal experts have estimated that the total compensation was in the tens of millions of dollars. The human cost was measured not in lives lost but in livelihoods ruined. The mine was closed. The miners were laid off. The Diamond Crystal Salt Company had to find a new source of salt. They built a new mine in a different location, but the Lake Peigneur mine was the company's primary source. The company's operations were disrupted for years. The drilling industry changed. After the Lake Peigneur disaster, the American Petroleum Institute revised its guidelines for drilling near mines. The revisions required that a survey of the mine be conducted before drilling. The survey had to be performed by an independent firm. The results had to be submitted to the state regulator. The driller had to maintain a minimum distance of 100 feet from the mine boundary. The minimum distance had to be confirmed by a second independent survey. The incident also prompted a change in the way drillers responded to loss of circulation. Loss of circulation had always been a common occurrence in drilling. It happened when the drill bit encountered a porous formation that absorbed the drilling mud. The typical response was to pump more mud or to add lost circulation material, such as fibrous material or granular solids, to the mud. The driller would try to seal the formation and continue drilling. After Lake Peigneur, drillers were trained to treat loss of circulation as a potential indication of a void. If the void could be connected to a mine, the driller was required to stop drilling and investigate. The driller was required to check the mine maps. If there was any uncertainty, the driller had to contact the mine operator. The broader lesson was that the underground world is not fully known. Geologists and engineers rely on models and surveys. The models are approximations. The surveys have error margins. The error margins are often assumed to be small, but they can be large. The Lake Peigneur disaster was a case study in the consequences of ignoring uncertainty. The disaster also highlighted the importance of communication between companies. The salt company and the driller had exchanged information, but the information was incomplete. The salt company had provided a map, but the map did not show the exact boundaries of the mine. The driller had provided a well plan, but the plan had not been verified by an independent survey. Both companies assumed that the other party had the correct data. Neither party took the time to cross-check. In the decades after the disaster, similar events continued to occur. In 1994, a sinkhole in Florida swallowed a house. The sinkhole was caused by the collapse of an underground cavity left by phosphate mining. In 1998, a sinkhole in Texas swallowed a 3-acre pond. The sinkhole was caused by the collapse of an underground brine cavern. In 2007, a drill bit in Germany punctured a salt mine. The mine was flooded, but the miners were evacuated. In 2010, a sinkhole in Guatemala City swallowed a 3-story building. The sinkhole was caused by a combination of sewer leakage and volcanic ash. Each of these events shared a common feature. The subsurface contained a void that was not known to exist. The void was either natural or man-made. The void was discovered only when something collapsed. The Lake Peigneur disaster remains the most dramatic example. It is the only case where an entire lake drained into the earth. It is the only case where a drilling operation directly caused the destruction of a mine. It is the only case where the flow of an entire canal was reversed. The site today is a tourist attraction. Visitors can walk along the shore and see the deep blue water of the new lake. The water is clear because it is salt water. The bottom of the lake is visible in the shallow areas. The sinkhole itself is now a family of underwater caves. The caves are dangerous. The edges are unstable. The depth is extreme. The disaster has been studied by engineers, geologists, and regulators. It is a standard case in textbooks. It is a cautionary tale about the limits of human control over the underground. The unanswered question remains: how many other voids are there beneath the surface? How many lakes, rivers, and oceans are sitting on top of cavities that have not been mapped? The answer is unknowable. The Earth is full of hidden spaces. The only way to find them is to look, but looking is expensive. The cost of a survey is high. The cost of a disaster is higher, but the disaster does not happen until it happens. The Lake Peigneur disaster was a coincidence of errors. The drill bit was poorly calibrated. The map was outdated. The communication was incomplete. The regulator was understaffed. The driller was in a hurry. The miner was careless. All of these errors lined up in a single moment. The result was one of the strangest industrial disasters in history. It could have been worse. If the mine had been deeper, the water would have filled it faster. If the drill bit had entered during the day shift, when miners were deeper underground, people would have died. If the canal had not been there to carry salt water from the Gulf, the lake would have remained empty. The disaster was a near miss in terms of human life, but it was a direct hit in terms of environmental damage. The legacy of Lake Peigneur is that we cannot see what is beneath us. We can drill, we can survey, we can map. But there is always an error. The error can be small. It can be 20 feet. 20 feet was the distance between a normal drilling operation and a catastrophic collapse. 20 feet was the gap between the known and the unknown. In the days that followed the disaster, investigators from the Mine Safety and Health Administration, the United States Geological Survey, and the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources arrived at the site. They found a lake that was no longer a lake in any familiar sense. The water surface was calm, but the depth had changed forever. Sonar surveys conducted on November 22, 1980, revealed a crater that plunged to 1,300 feet in some areas. The pre-disaster depth of Lake Peigneur had been an average of 10 feet. The new lake held a volume of water nearly 100 times greater than before. The investigators needed to understand how the flow had reversed. They traced the water back through the Delcambre Canal to the Gulf of Mexico. Over a period of 48 hours, the canal had carried a volume of salt water equivalent to the flow of the Mississippi River for several hours. The salt water had surged inland, flooding freshwater marshes. The sudden influx of salt killed fish, plants, and invertebrates that had evolved in a brackish environment. The Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries estimated that the ecological damage to the surrounding wetlands would take years to recover. Some species never returned. At the mine itself, the entrance was blocked by a plug of salt and debris that had been pushed upward by the intrushing water. The mine was effectively sealed from the surface. The miners who had escaped were interviewed repeatedly by company officials and investigators. They described the sound of the flooding as a rumble that began deep below and grew louder. One miner said it sounded like a train coming from the earth. Another said it was like standing under a waterfall. The water had risen so fast that they had no time to retrieve personal belongings. They left behind tools, lunchboxes, and safety equipment. The mine was abandoned as a loss. The investigation then focused on the drilling operation. The drilling rig, operated by Texaco, had been contracted to Wilson Brothers. The tool used to survey the wellbore was owned and operated by Eastman Whipstock. The tool was a magnetic single-shot survey instrument. It measured the inclination of the wellbore relative to vertical and the azimuth relative to magnetic north. The instrument had been used on a previous job without recalibration. The steel drill pipe had a slight magnetic charge. The tool picked up that charge and recorded it as a false azimuth. The error was not random. It was systematic. The magnetic pull from the pipe was consistent enough to shift every reading by a small amount. Over the course of the drilling, that shift accumulated. The surveyors believed the well was staying above the mine. In reality, it was descending at an angle. When the drill bit finally entered the mine, it did so at a point that was 20 feet lower than the survey indicated. That 20 feet was the difference between destruction and safety. The investigators also examined the mine map provided by Diamond Crystal Salt Company. The map showed the boundaries of the mine, but those boundaries had been drawn from surveys taken years earlier. The mine had been expanded since the map was made. The driller relied on the map, but the map was not current. The mine operator had not informed Texaco of the recent expansions. There was no requirement to share updates. The communication gap was not malicious. It was simply not considered necessary. The state regulator, the Louisiana Office of Conservation, had reviewed the drilling permit application. The office had a small staff and limited resources. They accepted the well plan and the mine map without independent verification. The permit was approved. No one asked if the survey tool had been calibrated. No one asked if the mine map was up to date. The system assumed that both companies were competent and honest. They were, but competence does not eliminate error. The legal fallout began almost immediately. Texaco filed a lawsuit against Eastman Whipstock, alleging negligence in the calibration of the survey tool. Eastman Whipstock countersued Texaco, claiming that the driller had failed to stop when loss of circulation occurred. Diamond Crystal Salt Company sued both Texaco and Eastman Whipstock for the destruction of the mine. The cases were consolidated in federal court. During the discovery phase, depositions were taken from every person involved. The driller, John Weber, testified that he had no reason to suspect the survey tool was faulty. He said he had used similar tools many times and trusted the readings. The tool hand from Eastman Whipstock, Kenneth McDaniel, testified that he had performed the calibration checks before the job. When pressed, he admitted that the calibration had been done with a test fixture, not in the field. The test fixture was designed to check the tool's general accuracy, but it could not detect the specific interference caused by the drill pipe. The tool had not been tested in the actual wellbore. Expert witnesses for both sides debated the magnitude of the error. One expert calculated that the magnetic interference could have shifted the readings by as much as 2 degrees. Over a horizontal distance of several thousand feet, that error translated into a vertical displacement of 20 feet. Another expert argued that the error could have been larger, but the well would have collided with the mine at a different point. The consensus was that the survey error was the primary cause. The trial never reached a verdict. The parties settled out of court. The terms were sealed, but estimates placed the total compensation at around $30 million. Texaco paid a portion. Eastman Whipstock paid a portion. Diamond Crystal Salt Company received compensation for the loss of the mine and the disruption to its operations. The settlement covered the cost of building a new mine elsewhere. The environmental restoration took longer. The Lake Peigneur area was designated a Superfund site by the Environmental Protection Agency. The designation allowed federal funds to be used for cleanup and monitoring. The salt water that had flooded the surrounding marshes slowly drained back into the lake over several months. The salinity levels returned to near normal, but the ecosystem had shifted. Invasive species that could tolerate higher salinity moved in. The native species struggled. The lake remained deep, cold, and dark in its center. In the years that followed, the site became a laboratory for studying sinkhole formation. Geologists from the USGS conducted sonar mapping of the crater. They discovered a complex of underwater caves and fissures that extended from the main cavity. The caves were connected to the salt dome. The salt dome itself was a massive plug of salt that had been pushed upward from deep underground over millions of years. The salt was nearly pure, which made it valuable for mining. The salt dome also contained pockets of natural gas and oil. The drilling that triggered the disaster was part of an oil exploration effort, not a salt mining operation. The disaster changed the way drilling companies approached projects near existing mines. The American Petroleum Institute issued a revised bulletin, API Bulletin D20, in Niniitwo. The bulletin specified that any drilling within 1,000 feet of a known mine must include an independent survey. The survey had to be verified by a separate company. The well plan had to be submitted to the mine operator, and the mine operator had to confirm the location of the mine boundaries. The driller had to maintain a minimum distance of 100 feet from the mine boundary at all times. These guidelines became standard practice across the industry. The Louisiana Office of Conservation also updated its regulations. The new rules required that all survey tools be calibrated before each job. The calibration had to be documented and filed with the state. The driller was required to stop drilling immediately if loss of circulation occurred within 500 feet of a known void. The driller had to contact the mine operator and the state regulator before resuming drilling. The regulatory changes were slow but effective. Despite these improvements, similar incidents continued around the world. In 1994, a drill bit punctured an abandoned salt mine near Hutchinson, Kansas. The mine had been flooded, and the drill struck a pocket of natural gas trapped in the mine. The gas escaped and ignited, causing an explosion that killed no one but destroyed the drilling rig. In 2001, a drilling operation in Louisiana struck an oil field that was connected to an abandoned salt mine. The oil and gas migrated into the mine and caused a series of underground fires. The mine was sealed and abandoned. The 2007 disaster in Germany, near the town of Unterbriesbach, was the closest parallel to Lake Peigneur. A drill bit punctured a salt mine that had been used for storage. The mine was flooded with brine. The miners evacuated in time. The loss of the mine cost the operator hundreds of millions of dollars. The investigation found that the survey tool had been calibrated, but the mine map was outdated. The same pattern repeated. Each of these events reinforced a central lesson: the underground is not static. Mines expand. Salt domes dissolve. Earthquakes shift formations. Water erodes cavities. The map of the subsurface is always an approximation. The only way to know a void exists is to drill into it. By then, it is often too late. The Lake Peigneur disaster also raised questions about the reliability of magnetic survey tools. The method used in 1980 is still in use today, though it has been supplemented by gyroscopic surveys and inertial navigation systems. Gyroscopic instruments are not affected by magnetic interference, but they are expensive and time-consuming to operate. Magnetic tools remain common because they are cheaper and faster. The calibration procedures have improved, but the risk of undetected interference still exists. Engineers now recommend that magnetic surveys be cross-checked with gyroscopic surveys when drilling near known hazards. The human cost of the disaster extended beyond the miners. The town of New Iberia, located near the lake, experienced a brief economic shock. The mine had employed around 100 people. Those workers lost their jobs. Some found work at other mines. Others left the region. The salt company, Diamond Crystal, survived but never returned to Lake Peigneur. The deepwater crater was too dangerous to reopen. The families of the miners received compensation from the settlements. No one was killed, but the psychological trauma was significant. Many of the miners reported nightmares and anxiety for years. They had faced a death that was slow and certain, drowning in the dark with no way to escape. They had survived by making a decision that could have gone wrong. The decision to run upward through the mine was not a given. Some miners had wanted to stay and block the tunnel. Others had wanted to go deeper, thinking the water would rise slower. The foreman made the call. It was the right call. The disaster also changed the way the public viewed industrial accidents. The footage of the lake draining, the barges sinking, and the canal reversing was broadcast on national news. People saw the power of underground cavities for the first time. The event became a cautionary tale in geology and engineering classrooms. It is still taught today as a case study in risk management, system failure, and the limits of human knowledge. In the decades since, the technology for mapping the subsurface has advanced. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic imaging, and aerial LiDAR can detect voids and anomalies, but these methods have limitations. Deep cavities may not produce a clear signal. Salt is transparent to some types of radar. The bottom of a sinkhole can be masked by debris. No technology can guarantee that the ground beneath your feet is solid. The Lake Peigneur disaster remains the most dramatic example of what happens when the ground gives way. It is a reminder that the Earth is not a solid object. It is a layered, porous, dynamic system. Human activity drills into that system, extracts resources, and creates voids. The voids can collapse. The collapse can be sudden. The consequences can be catastrophic. The site today is a quiet spot. Tourists park at a small overlook and read a historical marker. The water is blue and clear. In the summer, it is warm at the surface and cold at depth. Divers have explored the crater, but the depths are dangerous. The caves are dark and tight. The edges are unstable. No one has died there since the disaster, but the risk remains. The question that lingers is not about Lake Peigneur alone. It is about every site where drilling has occurred. How many wells have passed within feet of an unmapped void? How many mines are hidden beneath cities, lakes, and farms? The answer is unknown. The investigation into the disaster revealed that the mine map was off by hundreds of feet in some areas. The error was not discovered until after the collapse. That error could have been discovered earlier. It was not. The story of Lake Peigneur is a story of a system that failed at every level. The tool was not calibrated. The map was outdated. The communication was incomplete. The regulation was weak. The response was slow. The cost was high. The lessons were learned. The lessons were applied. But the same system still exists. The same vulnerabilities remain. The next disaster could happen tomorrow. It could be a sinkhole swallowing a highway. It could be a mine flooding unexpectedly. It could be a lake draining into the earth. The only way to prevent it is to know what is underground. Knowing what is underground requires surveys. Surveys cost money. The cost of not knowing is higher, but the cost is not paid until the disaster occurs. The Lake Peigneur disaster is a permanent reminder of that mathematics. The drill bit entered the mine at 9:40 a.m. on November 21, 1980. Within minutes, the lake was gone. The canal reversed. The barges sank. The mine filled. The earth collapsed. All because of 20 feet. 20 feet was the gap between the known and the unknown. The known was the survey reading that showed the well was safe. The unknown was the actual position of the drill bit. The gap was small enough to ignore. It was large enough to destroy a lake. In the hours after the drill bit punched into the mine, the Louisiana Office of Conservation began a formal investigation. That investigation would take months to complete. The first step was to secure the drilling rig. The rig had been abandoned in a hurry. The crew had fled when they saw the water rising. The rig was now perched on the edge of a crater that had swallowed a lake. Investigators could not approach it without risking their own lives. They had to wait until the site stabilized. On November 24, 1980, 3 days after the collapse, a team of surveyors arrived at the site. They brought with them a new magnetic survey tool. That tool had been calibrated before leaving the warehouse. The surveyors set up their equipment at the location of the wellhead. The wellhead had been destroyed. All that remained was a bent piece of casing sticking out of the mud. The surveyors took readings. They compared those readings to the original survey data from the day of the disaster. The difference was 17 feet. 17 feet, not 20. The discrepancy was smaller than the investigators had expected, but 17 feet was enough. The drill bit had been 17 feet closer to the mine boundary than the crew believed. The mine boundary itself was not a straight line. It curved. The map showed a buffer of 100 feet. The actual distance between the drill bit and the mine wall had been well under 50 feet. The tool error had compounded with the map error. The result was a puncture. The investigators then examined the maintenance records of the survey tool. The tool had been serviced 3 months before the disaster. The service log showed that one of the compass needles had been replaced. The replacement needle had not been recalibrated after installation. The calibration procedure required a test run on a known magnetic field. That test had not been performed. The tool was returned to service with a compass that was off by 2 degrees. 2 degrees over a depth of 5,000 feet produced a lateral error of nearly 20 feet. The crew had no way of knowing this. They had followed standard procedure. They had taken a reading at the surface and a reading at depth. They had calculated the difference. They had assumed the tool was accurate. The tool was not. The investigation also looked at the mine map. The map had been drawn in 196 It was based on surveys conducted while the mine was still being excavated. The surveyors at that time had used a different instrument, a theodolite, not a magnetic compass. The theodolite readings were precise, but the map had been redrafted several times. With each redraft, small errors were introduced. A line that was supposed to be straight was drawn as curved. A corner that was supposed to be 90 degrees was drawn as 88 degrees. The cumulative error was not large, but it was enough to shift the mine boundary by as much as 30 feet in some areas. The legal proceedings began in early 198. The salt company, Diamond Crystal, filed a lawsuit against the oil company Texaco. The lawsuit sought compensation for the loss of the mine, the equipment, and the salt reserves. The total value of the claim was estimated at over $100 million. The drilling contractor, Wilson Brothers, was also named as a defendant. The trial lasted several years. The evidence was technical. The question was not whether the drill hit the mine. It was who was responsible for the error. Texaco argued that the mine map was inaccurate and that Diamond Crystal had failed to provide an accurate survey. Diamond Crystal argued that the drilling crew should have stopped when they lost circulation. The judge ruled that both parties shared responsibility. Texaco was ordered to pay a settlement of approximately $25 million. Diamond Crystal received the money but never reopened the mine. The flooded caverns were too unstable. The salt had dissolved in the water. The structure of the dome had been weakened. The mine was abandoned permanently. The disaster also led to changes in the way drilling permits were issued. Before 1980, a drilling company only had to submit a general location plan. After 1980, the state required a detailed survey of the drill path, including a calculation of the uncertainty margin. The drilling company had to provide proof that the tool had been calibrated within the previous 30 days. The mine operator had to provide a certified map drawn within the previous 10 years. If the map was older than 10 years, a new survey had to be conducted before drilling could begin. These regulations were adopted by other states. Texas, which sits on a vast network of salt domes and oil fields, updated its rules in 1998. Mississippi followed in 1993. The federal government issued guidance for drilling on federal lands in 1985. The changes were slow but systematic. Each year, the number of near misses decreased. The number of actual punctures decreased. The system became safer, but the system was not perfect. In 1990, a drill bit punctured a salt mine in Kansas. The mine was not active. It had been used for natural gas storage. The gas escaped and caused a fire that burned for 3 days. No one was killed. The investigation found that the drill bit had passed within 5 feet of a mapped cavity. The tool had been calibrated. The map had been certified. The error was caused by a magnetic anomaly in the rock. The anomaly was not detected. In 2002, a similar incident occurred in Texas. A drill bit punctured a brine well that had been used for chemical waste disposal. The waste migrated into the water table. The contamination spread over an area of several square miles. The cleanup cost exceeded $50 million. The investigation found that the survey tool had been calibrated, but the calibration had been performed using the wrong reference point. The error was less than 10 feet. It was enough. Each of these incidents reiterated the same lesson. The underground is not a fixed environment. Magnetic fields shift. Salt dissolves. Rock fractures. Earthquakes can displace entire formations. The map is always a snapshot of a moment in time. The drill bit is always moving. The gap between the two is never zero. The Lake Peigneur disaster remains the largest drilling-related cavity collapse in recorded history. The volume of water that drained into the mine was estimated at 3 billion gallons. The depth of the crater reached over 1,000 feet. The shockwave was felt at the surface as a low rumble. The water in the lake did not drain slowly. It drained in a matter of hours. The whirlpool formed and vanished. The canal reversed flow. The barges sank. The trees were pulled under. What happened that day was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of information. The driller did not know where he was. The mine operator did not know where the drill was. The regulator did not know that the system could fail. The information did not exist. The error was invisible until it became unstoppable. The site today is a reminder of that invisibility. The lake is calm. The water is clear. The crater is hidden beneath the surface. If you stand on the shore and look out, you see nothing unusual. The only clue is the depth. The lake is now over 1,000 feet deep in the center. It was originally 10 feet deep. The difference is the measure of the disaster. The story of Lake Peigneur is not a story about a lake. It is a story about the limits of human perception. We believe we can measure the Earth. We can probe it with drills and sensors. We can map it with lines and numbers. But the Earth is not a number. It is a place where the distance between what we know and what is real can be as small as 17 feet. And 17 feet is small enough to destroy everything.